totally agree on your statement that technology is something that can solve many problems, although of course you need to think about the complexity of the problem first. But in a way, tech is something that is easy to replicate. It's easy to be deployed. One solution can be used by thousands of users at the same time, and that totally answers the size and the scale of megacity. For example, in Jakarta, we have 10 million people if you look at just the center of the city, and then 30 million people if you consider all the periphery of it. And one solution could be used interchangeably, by the people either in the center or in the periphery. I think in the case of Jakarta, and I think this has been replicated in other provinces as well. They have an innovation called Report, where people, in Indonesia it's called lapor in our language, which essentially translated into report. So what they do is that with this app, people can sort of capture their surrounding if they find any problems, whether it's a strip lamps that are not functioning or a pothole or anything that goes, and that can be reported directly to the department that is dealing with that problem. This is sort of bridging the communications from the people to the government officials just with a smartphone. And then what we see is that the response from the government towards that, because of course there has to be a policy that support this sort of interactions, and now the government officials directly respond to that, and people see that if I use this app, I can get an actual response afterwards, and that sort of foster and increase the level of trust from the people to the government, and that sort of encourages them to keep on using that, and that the government can also crowdsource information from the ground, and that helps a lot with solving problems that might not otherwise be discovered by the government themselves if they don't have the tools to do that. And we do that as well in West Java, where we work in Jabar Digital Service. And we wanted to do better, of course. So we have our own app called Sapa Warga, where we put together 10 different features. And we not only have an application, but also we sort of give a tablet and smartphones, because the situation in many other places in Indonesia is that they have a mix of cities and megacities and those in rural areas. And the question is how to narrow the digital divide between those who are more privileged and those who are not. So giving the access, the infrastructure, the smartphones to them, even just for the community leaders, I think it's a good representative for the community's interest in civic space in general. And giving them this access enable us to be better informed as government, and therefore be able to better serve the people using tech in the context of megacity and even beyond just megacity as well.
To beyond this point, I think it's really good example how cities can learn from each other, and that's one thing that we promote, shared learning between city practitioners. One thing that came up from our discussion here in the Holding Dialogue is about, do we understand our megacities in the most appropriate way? And one thing that I can share from one of the examples from our member cities, one of them is from Melbourne. So they propose, so they want to promote a more holistic approach in addressing different issues related to urban heat, for example. And then, so one of the intervention is to urban forest strategy. But in Melbourne, there's no such thing as one map on the current situation across the metropolitan. So that's why technology is important. So one of the first steps that Melbourne took was mapping the green coverage of about 31 councils around Melbourne as a base for a further policy advice, policy planning to address in a more holistic way of addressing multi-issues from urban heat and then well-being, aesthetic of the city, so that it will provide benefit for the whole city in many different elements.
There's this future forecast that by 2045, 75% of Indonesians will be living in cities. This can be good or bad, depends on how you see it. And then there are perhaps two main reasons why this kind of change could happen. The first one is that villages might transform themselves into cities with modernizations and better infrastructure. But also another alternative is that people starts to move out from villages into cities because there are better opportunities in cities, better livelihood. That's the kind of presumption that people usually have. So there are push and pull factors that happen. But it's also concerning in regards to many facets, especially like the supply chain and demand and the ecosystem between people who live in villages and rural-urban relationship. So I think what we do in our province, and I think this is also sort of replicated in many other places as well, is to ensure that villages, that the livelihood of people who live in village can also be improved. So I think development in a sense shouldn't be concentrated just in big cities, but in general, if you really wanted to promote the livelihood in the big cities, you also have to think about how, the interactions of these big cities with the areas surrounding it. By then you could, sort of stabilize the livelihood of people who live in urban and rural and their relationship. So what we do is that we introduced a lot of initiative to sort of narrow the gap, narrow the digital divide between rural and urban. So introduce infrastructure. So perhaps in our view, we would prefer that the projection can come into reality, but with the villages transforming themselves into better infrastructure instead of people moving out from villages and leaving agriculture and other stuffs that might be unable to sustain the livelihood in big cities if the rural areas are not, performing their roles in a way. So, yeah, it really depends on how you see it. But the thing is that by this kind of forecast, we're able to sort of better manage and anticipate the trend that is going on in the future. And I think with better planning, and with this knowledge that we need to cater the needs of a lot of these enfranchised and marginalized groups and people in rural areas, I think this would sort of take us to a better sort of development mechanism in the future.
I'm really excited about the future of urban Indonesia, especially as the demographic in Indonesia. We have a young demographic, so I hope that we really use that opportunity for the future of the urban world in Indonesia. So, we see many startups, many creative movement coming in Indonesia, especially here in Jakarta. The only thing is that I hope that there's a risk of the growth of this exciting urban future will be outpacing the ability to provide infrastructure and what's beyond that. So it's a I guess interesting balance, but I'm hopeful, and I believe in Indonesian, young Indonesian, that they can be the face of the urban future